The autumn rain drummed relentlessly against the tall windows of Margaret's brownstone apartment in Boston's historic Back Bay neighborhood. Outside, the gas lamps flickered to life along Commonwealth Avenue as evening approached, casting golden pools of light on the wet cobblestones. Inside, Margaret sat surrounded by the remnants of her great-aunt Eleanor's long life. Cardboard boxes overflowing with photographs, letters tied with faded ribbons, and leather-bound albums that exhaled the musty scent of decades past. Margaret wiped her dusty hands on her cotton apron and reached for another photograph album, its burgundy leather cover cracked with age. Most of the images were typical of their era, stern-faced relatives posed stiffly in their Sunday best, children in sailor suits standing beside ornate furniture, and ladies in elaborate feathered hats gathered for tea parties. The formal poses and sepia tones spoke of a world where photography was still a special occasion, requiring patience and considerable expense, but one particular photograph made her pause, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. The image, carefully labeled in Eleanor's spidery handwriting as Thanksgiving 1907, Hartford residence, showed an opulent dining room prepared for the holiday feast. A massive mahogany table dominated the center of the frame, its surface gleaming under the soft light from a crystal chandelier. Fine china plates were arranged precisely at each place setting, accompanied by multiple pieces of silverware and delicate crystal glasses that caught the light like scattered diamonds. A woman in an elegant, high-collared dress stood gracefully beside an ornate fireplace, her dark hair arranged in the Gibson girl style popular at the time. Her hand rested on the carved mantelpiece, and though she smiled for the camera, there was something unsettling in her eyes, a shadow of anxiety that seemed at odds with the festive setting. Two distinguished gentlemen in formal dark suits flanked her, their expressions serious but pleasant, yet Margaret detected an unusual tension in their rigid postures. The room itself spoke of considerable wealth and refined taste. Elaborate floral wallpaper covered the walls, and heavy brocade curtains framed the windows. An intricate oriental rug spread beneath the dining table, its rich patterns adding warmth to the formal scene. Something about the photograph troubled Margaret deeply, though she couldn't quite identify what was wrong. 3 days later, Margaret sat at her small kitchen table with her laptop humming quietly beside her, the mysterious photograph placed carefully next to the computer. As a librarian at Boston University's archives, she had developed a methodical approach to historical research that served her well in both professional and personal investigations. The November afternoon light streaming through her kitchen window provided perfect illumination for her work. Using her high-resolution scanner, she carefully digitized the 1907 photograph, taking care to capture every detail. The resulting image on her computer screen was remarkably clear, revealing subtleties that had been impossible to see with the naked eye. She could now make out individual brushstrokes in the wallpaper's floral pattern, the delicate etching on the crystal glasses, and even the grain of the wood in the dining table. Margaret began her examination systematically, zooming in on different sections of the photograph. The china pattern became clearly identifiable as Haviland Limoges, an expensive French porcelain favored by wealthy American families of the period. The silverware appeared to be sterling, arranged in the formal European style with multiple forks and specialized serving pieces. Every detail reinforced her impression that this was indeed a prosperous household celebrating in grand style. She studied the faces more closely, noting the woman's carefully arranged hair and the quality of her dress fabric. The men's suits were expertly tailored, suggesting they were gentlemen of means and social standing. Their poses were formal but natural, indicating they were comfortable in such elegant surroundings. Moving her cursor across the image, Margaret examined the fireplace mantel with its collection of brass candlesticks and an ornate clock, the heavy drapery with its rich patterns, and the beautiful oriental rug spread beneath the dining table. Everything appeared perfectly consistent with an upper-class American home of 1907. Then she zoomed in on the shadowy area beneath the dining table. Margaret's breath caught in her throat, and she leaned closer to the screen, adjusting the brightness and contrast controls. There, partially concealed by the white linen tablecloth and hidden in the deep shadows it cast, was something that absolutely should not have been there. At first glance, it might have been dismissed as a trick of light or perhaps a flaw in the century-old photograph, but as she enhanced the image further, the truth became unmistakably and horrifyingly clear. It was a human hand, pale and lifeless, extending from beneath the elegant tablecloth. The fingers were positioned at an unnatural angle, and dark stains, quite possibly blood, were visible on the light-colored fabric nearby. Margaret's hands trembled as she stared at the computer screen, her mind racing to process what she had discovered. Her first impulse was to call the police, but she quickly realized how absurd that would sound to a desk sergeant. The crime, if indeed it was a crime, had occurred over a century ago. Any perpetrators would be long dead, and any evidence would have crumbled to dust decades ago. Instead, she turned to her laptop and began searching the internet for any information about the photograph's origins. The careful notation, Hartford residence, suggested Connecticut, and she decided to start there. The Hartford Historical Society's comprehensive website proved to be an excellent resource, containing detailed information about the city's prominent families and their residences during the early 1900s. Within 2 hours of focused searching, Margaret had found a promising lead. A 1906 article in the Hartford Courant's Society pages described the elaborate homes of several wealthy textile manufacturers, including detailed descriptions of their interior decorations. One house in particular caught her attention, the residence of Charles Whitmore, whose living and dining rooms were described in language that perfectly matched what she saw in the photograph. The article mentioned the distinctive carved fireplace mantel, imported from Italy at considerable expense, and the hand-painted wallpaper that had been specially ordered from a famous French manufacturer. These details, combined with the overall layout of the room, convinced Margaret that she had identified the correct house. Further, research revealed that Charles Whitmore was, indeed, a successful textile manufacturer who had built his fortune. During the industrial boom of the late 1800s, he and his wife, Catherine, were prominent members of Hartford society, frequently mentioned in the newspapers, social columns for their elaborate dinner parties and charitable activities. Margaret's pulse quickened as she discovered a reference to a Thanksgiving gathering at the Whitmore residence in 1907. According to a society page published in early December, the event had been a gathering of family and close friends to celebrate the holiday, but had been unexpectedly abbreviated due to a family emergency that required immediate attention. The vague language of the newspaper report struck Margaret as suspicious. In an era when social events were described in elaborate detail, this brief and evasive mention seemed to suggest that something had gone wrong that evening, something the family preferred not to discuss publicly. She continued digging through the newspaper archives, looking for any other mentions of the Whitmore family around that time. Margaret's research took on new urgency as she delved deeper into the Hartford newspaper, archives from late 1907. In the days immediately following Thanksgiving, she found several intriguing items buried in the back pages of the Hartford Courant. The first was a brief missing person notice published on November 30th, just 2 days after the holiday. The notice described James Aldrich, age 34, as a respected traveling textile agent who had failed to return to his boarding house after attending a dinner engagement on Thanksgiving evening. According to the report, Aldrich had been expected to depart for New York City on November 29th to conduct business with several clothing manufacturers, but he had never arrived for his scheduled appointments. The description painted a picture of a reliable, well-regarded businessman whose sudden disappearance was completely out of character. Aldrich was described as being of medium height with dark hair and a mustache, always impeccably dressed and known for his punctuality and professional demeanor. His landlady at the boarding house, Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, was quoted as saying that Mr. Aldrich had never failed to inform her of his travel plans and that his personal belongings remained undisturbed in his room. What struck Margaret as particularly odd was how quickly the case had been resolved, or at least how quickly it had been closed. On December 7th, barely a week after the initial report, a small notice appeared in the newspaper stating that James Aldrich had been located safe and well, conducting business in New York City, and that all concerns regarding his welfare have been satisfactorily resolved. The brevity and vague language of this follow-up report troubled Margaret. In an era when newspapers typically provided detailed accounts of local happenings, this terse announcement seemed deliberately uninformative. No details were provided about where exactly Aldrich had been found, why he had failed to contact anyone during his absence, or how the misunderstanding had occurred. Margaret printed copies of both articles and studied them carefully. The timeline was suspicious. Aldrich had disappeared after a dinner at what appeared to be the same house shown in her photograph, and his case had been closed with minimal investigation. She began to suspect that James Aldrich might never have made it to New York City at all, and that the hand visible beneath the table in that 1907 photograph might belong to him. She realized she needed to examine official police records to learn more about how this case had been handled. The next morning found Margaret driving through the crisp November air toward Hartford, her laptop bag containing printouts of all her research thus far. The Connecticut State Library had extensive archives, but she was particularly interested in accessing police records from 1907. Her destination was the Hartford Police Museum, housed in the original police headquarters building that had served the city during the early 1900s. Detective Robert Thompson, recently retired after 30 years with the Hartford Police Department, now volunteered as the museum's curator and research coordinator. When Margaret explained her unusual request, his weathered face showed immediate interest. He had always been fascinated by cold cases, and this one was certainly cold, over a century old. "Let me take a look at that photograph," Thompson said, adjusting his reading glasses as Margaret opened her laptop. When the enhanced image appeared on the screen, his expression grew serious. "Well, that's definitely a human hand," he confirmed without hesitation. "And those dark stains around it? Well, they're consistent with blood spatter. The positioning suggests the body was placed there after death, probably to conceal it temporarily." Thompson led Margaret through a maze of filing cabinets containing police records from Hartford's early years. Police work was very different in 1907, he explained as they searched. Department procedures were less standardized, forensic science was in its infancy, and local politics played a much larger role in determining which cases received serious attention. Wealthy families had considerable influence over how investigations were conducted. They located the original police file on James Aldrich's disappearance, a thin folder containing handwritten reports and witness statements. The investigating officer had been Sergeant Patrick O'Malley, an Irish immigrant who had worked his way up through the ranks and was known for his thoroughness and integrity. O'Malley's initial report was far more detailed than what had appeared in the newspapers. According to his notes, he had personally interviewed all the guests who had attended the Thanksgiving dinner at the Whitmore residence. Besides the host family, the attendees included James Aldrich, Dr. Edward Mills, the family's personal physician, and Mrs. Robert Crawford, Catherine Whitmore's younger sister, and a frequent visitor to the household. The witness statements were remarkably consistent. Everyone agreed that James Aldrich had left the dinner early, around 8 p.m., claiming he felt unwell and needed to return to his boarding house to rest before his planned departure to New York. According to their accounts, he had seemed slightly pale during dinner but had been in good spirits and had participated normally in the conversation. However, Thompson pointed to a curious notation scrawled in O'Malley's handwriting in the margin of the report. Timeline doesn't match. Check with family again. Something not right about their story. Margaret's investigation took a crucial turn when she decided to research the professional relationship between Charles Whitmore and James Aldrich. At the Connecticut Historical Society, she discovered that their connection was far more complex than a simple business dinner between acquaintances. The Society's business archives revealed that Aldrich wasn't merely a traveling textile agent, as the newspaper had described him. He was actually Charles Whitmore's business partner in several lucrative ventures, and their professional relationship dated back to 1905. The partnership had been formalized through a series of legal contracts that outlined their respective responsibilities and profit-sharing arrangements. Aldrich had provided substantial capital, investment, and maintained connections with clothing manufacturers throughout the Northeast, while Whitmore contributed his textile manufacturing expertise and factory facilities. Their joint ventures had been remarkably successful, particularly in securing contracts to supply fabric for the rapidly growing ready-made clothing industry centered in New York City. However, by 1907, serious cracks had begun to appear in their business relationship. Court records showed that Aldrich had filed a lawsuit against Whitmore in October 1907, just 1 month before his disappearance. The lawsuit alleged that Whitmore had been systematically violating their partnership agreements by selling fabric to competing manufacturers at prices significantly below their established minimums, thereby undermining their shared contracts and costing Aldrich thousands of dollars in lost profits. Margaret found copies of heated correspondence between the two men in Whitmore's business papers, which had been donated to the Historical Society by his descendants in the 1960s. The letters revealed an escalating conflict that had grown increasingly bitter throughout. 1907, Aldrich accused Whitmore of dishonesty and breach of contract, threatening to dissolve their partnership and expose what he called fraudulent business practices to their industry colleagues. Whitmore's responses were equally hostile, claiming that Aldrich was being unreasonable and suggesting that his partner's unstable temperament and unrealistic demands were damaging their business relationships with customers and suppliers. The final letter in the collection, dated November 20th, 1907, just 8 days before Thanksgiving, was particularly ominous. Written by Aldrich to Whitmore, it read, "Charles, I will be attending your Thanksgiving dinner as previously planned, but do not mistake this for a social visit. We will settle our business differences once and for all that evening, or I will have no choice but to expose your fraudulent practices to every textile manufacturer from Hartford to New York City. The truth will come out, one way or another." Margaret realized that James Aldrich hadn't attended that Thanksgiving dinner as a friend or casual business associate. He had come to confront Whitmore about their partnership dispute, and based on what she had discovered in the photograph, that confrontation had turned deadly. Margaret's attention next focused on Dr. Edward Mills, who had been present at the Thanksgiving dinner according to the police records. If someone had indeed been killed that evening, a doctor's presence would have been crucial, either to provide medical assistance or, more sinisterly, to help cover up a death. At the Hartford Medical Society's archives, housed in a stately brick building near the old Hartford Hospital, Margaret found Dr. Mills's professional records, spanning nearly 4 decades of practice. He had been a well-respected physician, specializing in internal medicine, with a particular reputation for treating Hartford's wealthy families. His patient records showed that he had indeed been the Whitmore family's personal physician since 1895, and the relationship appeared to extend beyond professional medical care. Dr. Mills and Charles Whitmore had been classmates at Yale University, graduating together in 1878, and they had maintained their friendship through various business and social connections throughout their adult lives. Mills had even invested in some of Whitmore's textile ventures, Making him financially, as well as personally invested in Whitmore's success, what Margaret discovered next sent chills through her. In Dr. Mills's meticulously kept appointment book for November 1907, there was an entry for Thanksgiving Day that read, "Emergency consultation, C. Whitmore residence, 9:30 p.m. Family crisis requiring immediate attention." The timing was significant and deeply suspicious. According to all the witness statements given to police, James Aldrich had allegedly left the dinner at 8 p.m., yet the other guests had remained at the house until at least 10 p.m. Margaret also found an unusual pattern in Dr. Mills's schedule for the week following Thanksgiving. Several regular patient appointments had been canceled, with brief notes indicating the doctor was unavailable due to personal family emergency. This was highly unusual for Mills, who had built his reputation on never missing appointments and being available to his patients at all hours. Her research led her next to Hartford's Cedar Hill Cemetery, where she hoped to find additional information. The cemetery's burial records, maintained in a small office near the main entrance, show that Dr. Mills was indeed buried there, having died in 1923. But what caught Margaret's attention was an unusual entry in the burial records from December 1907, a plot purchased by Dr. Mills for unknown transient, no family. The plot was located in the cemetery's older section, in an area typically reserved for those without family or means to afford elaborate burials. It was marked only with a simple stone bearing the initials J.A. and the date, November 1907. Standing before the modest grave on a gray November afternoon, Margaret felt she might be looking at the final resting place of James Aldrich. Dr. Mills had not only been present when Aldrich died, he had apparently taken responsibility for arranging a quiet burial, helping to cover up whatever had truly happened that Thanksgiving evening in 1907. Margaret's breakthrough came when she decided to research Catherine Whitmore's sister, Mrs. Robert Crawford, who had also been present at the fateful dinner. Unlike the men involved, whose records were dominated by business dealings and professional activities, Mrs. Crawford had left behind a different kind of evidence, a detailed personal diary that spanned several decades of her life. The diary was housed at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard University's Radcliffe Institute, part of an extensive collection of women's writings from the early 1900s. Mrs. Crawford, whose first name was Helen, had donated her papers to the library in the 1940s, apparently hoping to preserve women's perspectives on historical events and social changes. Margaret's hands trembled with anticipation as she was granted access to the diary and carefully opened the leather-bound volume to the entries from November 1907. Helen Crawford's handwriting was neat and precise, reflecting the careful education typical of women of her social class. Her daily entries provided fascinating insights into the domestic and social life of a wealthy Hartford family during the Roosevelt era. The entry for November 28th, 07. Thanksgiving Day was longer and more detailed than usual, and its contents were explosive. According to Helen's account, the dinner had indeed begun pleasantly, with the usual family conversation and holiday traditions. However, the atmosphere had changed dramatically when James Aldrich began raising business matters at the dining table. Helen wrote, "Mr. Aldrich seemed agitated from the moment he arrived. Though he tried to maintain his usual pleasant demeanor during dinner, Charles attempted to keep the conversation light and festive, but Mr. Aldrich kept returning to matters of business, speaking in increasingly urgent tones about their partnership and what he called irregularities in their recent transactions. The situation had deteriorated rapidly after the main course was served. According to Helen's detailed account, Aldrich had demanded that he and Whitmore discuss their business problems immediately, rather than waiting for a more appropriate time. When Whitmore suggested they could meet in his office the following week, Aldrich had become more insistent, stating that he would not leave the house until their differences were resolved. The most damning entry came next. The argument between Charles and Mr. Aldrich became quite heated after we ladies retired to the sitting room. They went into Charles's study, and we could hear their voices raised in anger, though we could not make out the specific words. Then there was a terrible crash, followed by an awful silence that seemed to last forever. When Charles finally emerged from the study, he was pale as death and trembling. He told us there had been a dreadful accident, that Mr. Aldrich had fallen and struck his head on the corner of his desk. Dr. Mills examined him immediately, but declared that nothing could be done to help the poor man. Helen Crawford's diary entries continued with even more disturbing revelations about what had transpired that Thanksgiving evening. Margaret read on with growing horror as the full scope of the cover-up became clear. According to Helen's account, the aftermath of James Aldrich's death had been carefully orchestrated by Charles Whitmore, with the assistance of Dr. Mills and the reluctant participation of the other witnesses. Helen wrote, "Charles took charge immediately after Dr. Mills confirmed that Mr. Aldrich was dead. He said we must all remain calm and think of the scandal that would ensue if word got out that a man had died violently in our house. He reminded us of Catherine's delicate condition. She was expecting another child, and said the shock of a police investigation could endanger her health." The diary revealed that Whitmore had convinced the group that Aldrich's death had been a tragic accident. the result of his alleged drinking and aggressive behavior. However, Helen's private observations suggested she had serious doubts about this explanation. She wrote, "The wound on poor Mr. Aldrich's head was quite severe, more so than one would expect from simply falling against a desk. The blood was extensive, and the position of his body seemed unnatural. But Dr. Mills insisted that head injuries could be unpredictable, and that such damage was possible from a fall. The group had made a collective decision to protect Charles Whitmore from potential scandal and legal complications. They moved Aldrich's body from the study to the dining room, positioning it beneath the heavy table where it would be temporarily concealed. The plan was to wait until the following morning, then discover the body and claim that Aldrich had suffered some kind of medical emergency during the night. However, their plans had been complicated by an unexpected development. Helen wrote, "Before we could implement our plan, Catherine insisted on taking a photograph to commemorate our Thanksgiving gathering. She said it was important to document family occasions, and in her distressed state, she seemed to forget about our terrible situation. We couldn't refuse without arousing suspicion from the household staff, so we posed for the photograph as if nothing had happened. I pray that no one ever examines that image too closely. Dr. Mills had arranged for Aldrich's body to be removed from the house during the early morning hours, when the streets were empty and no neighbors would witness the activity. He had contacts at the city morgue, who could be trusted to ask no questions, and he handled all the arrangements for a quiet burial in an unmarked grave. Meanwhile, the family had concocted an elaborate story about Aldrich leaving early due to illness, then traveling to New York as planned. They had even arranged for associates in New York to provide false confirmations that he had arrived there safely, though Helen's diary suggested these individuals were unaware they were participating in a deception. The final entry related to the incident was perhaps the most chilling. We are all bound together now by this terrible secret. Charles says we must never speak of what really happened, that it would destroy multiple families and accomplish nothing since Mr. Aldrich is beyond help. But I cannot forget the look in his eyes when he confronted Charles, or the sound he made when he fell. I fear we have become accomplices to something far worse than an accident." Margaret closed Helen Crawford's diary and sat in the quiet reading room of the Schlesinger Library, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had discovered. The 1907 photograph that had seemed like an innocent family portrait was actually evidence of one of Hartford's most carefully concealed crimes, a murder that had been covered up. Through the combined efforts of some of the city's most respected citizens, the evidence was overwhelming and painted a clear picture of what had occurred that Thanksgiving evening. James Aldrich had come to the Whitmore house not as a friend, but as an angry business partner demanding resolution of their financial disputes. The confrontation in Charles Whitmore's study had turned violent, resulting in Aldrich's death under circumstances that were almost certainly not accidental. Despite the claims made by the witnesses, the subsequent cover-up had involved Dr. Edward Mills, who had used his medical authority to declare the death natural and had arranged for the secret burial. Catherine Whitmore and her sister Helen had been coerced into maintaining silence through appeals to family loyalty and fear of scandal. Even the Hartford police, in the person of Sergeant O'Malley, had been prevented from conducting a thorough investigation through political pressure and the influence of wealthy families. Margaret knew she had a responsibility to ensure that this century-old injustice was finally brought to light. While criminal prosecution was obviously impossible after so many years, the truth deserved to be told, and James Aldrich's memory deserved to be cleared of the false stories that had surrounded his disappearance. She contacted the Hartford Courant, the same newspaper that had published the misleading reports in 1907. The Courant editor, intrigued by the historical significance of Margaret's discoveries, assigned their best investigative reporter to work with her on a comprehensive article about the case. The story, when published, created a sensation throughout Connecticut and beyond, generating national attention for its combination of historical, mystery, and social commentary. Margaret also worked with the Hartford Historical Society and the Police Museum to ensure that the full story was properly documented and preserved. Detective Thompson helped to prepare a detailed case file that would serve as a permanent record of what had really happened to James Aldrich. The unmarked grave in Cedar Hill Cemetery received a proper headstone bearing Aldrich's full name and accurate dates, along with an inscription acknowledging him as a victim of injustice who had been denied proper recognition for over a century. Margaret kept the original photograph, but she saw it with completely different eyes now. What had once appeared to be a normal family gathering celebrating Thanksgiving was actually a moment frozen in time, a record of murder and conspiracy that had waited patiently for someone to look closely enough to discover the terrible secret hidden beneath that elegant dining table. The image served as a powerful reminder that sometimes the most significant historical truths are hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right person with the right tools and the persistence to zoom in and see what others had missed.